columns, Roman statues, and manicured gardens all spoke to the grandeur of the city's ancient past. But the hotel, located just off the Avenue de Grande Bretagne, somehow managed to feel modern and fresh. Mobot and Sai crossed a cobblestone courtyard, past a decorative fountain, and went inside. They moved through the grand lobby, which featured a magnificent atrium and giant skylight, to reach the elevators. Mobot's search of the reservation system told them Kendrick Stamp was in room 408, so they took one of the cars to the 4th floor and stepped into a quiet corridor, which reminded Mobot of a first-class train carriage. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling at regular intervals, and bench seats set in alcoves lined the walls. A vase of fragrant lilies had been placed in between each pair of doors on both sides of the corridor, filling the air with their heavy scent. The thick carpet felt so soft and luxurious, Mobot had the urge to take off her shoes and walk it barefoot. They found room 408 a short distance from the elevator, and could hear a TV playing CNN through the door. Sai knocked. The TV was switched off almost immediately. "Yeah?" a man asked through the closed door. "Kendrick Stamp," Mobot replied. "We'd like to talk to you, please." The spy hole darkened for a few seconds before the door opened a short way, restrained from going any further by the chain. The man who peered through the gap looked haunted. He had dark shadows around his eyes, days of grown-in stubble, and the dry lips of someone who had spent too long inside an air-conditioned room. He wore a white vest and jeans, and was barefoot. "Who are you?" Stamp asked. "Maureen Roth and Seymour Kloppenberg. We work for the detective agency?" Stamp interrupted. "I've heard of you." "I was at the bureau until a few months ago. Medical retirement." "I'm sorry to hear that," Sai said. "It is what it is." "Why are you in Monaco, Mr. Stamp?" Mobot asked, and he stiffened slightly. "Vacation," he replied. "Alone?" she pressed. Stamp didn't respond. "A colleague of ours was abducted," Mobot said. "The people who took her attempted to blackmail another colleague, trying to force him to do something to ensure her safe return." Stamp remained impassive. "I think I saw something about a kidnapping on the news," he replied at last. "So, you're not traveling with anyone?" Sai asked, and for a split second Stamp's strained smile wavered. "No," he said. "I'm alone." "Your wife is called Angela, right?" Mobot remarked. They'd found details of the couple on Angela's social media feeds. "Goes by Angie?" Stamp tried not to glare at Mobot, but he looked wounded. "She not with you?" Mobot asked. Stamp shook his head. "I told you. I'm alone." "Because if anything has happened to her, we can help," Mobot told him. "If she's being used to coerce you, we can support you. Don't trust these people if they're—" "I said I'm alone," Stamp interrupted. "I hope they find your friend who was kidnapped." "Oh, we found her, and she's safe," Mobot replied, registering her words hit home with him. "That's what we're saying. We can do things to help you. Real, practical things, like recovering people who've been taken. But we can only do those things if you tell us what kind of help you need." Stamp hesitated. "None," he said finally. "I don't need any help." He signaled Mobot to draw near, and she leaned forward. "You should go," he whispered. "They're watching me. It's not safe for you here." Chapter 67. Stamp took a step back. "I don't need any help," he said loudly for the benefit of an unseen audience. "Good luck with whatever you're involved in." He shut the door, and Mobot looked at Sai. "What did he say?" he asked. "That he's being watched," she replied. An elevator chime sounded. Mobot looked at Sai nervously. "Let's take the stairs, just in case," he said. They started toward a door marked Escalier, a few feet away, and had only taken a few steps when a trio of men in dark urban wear emerged from the elevator lobby. "Hey!" one of them yelled, producing a pistol from inside his jacket. "Run!" Mobot pushed Sai forward, and he burst through the stairwell door as the man started shooting. Bullets zinged through the air behind Mobot as she joined Sai, and the two of them barreled down the stairs as fast as their legs would carry them. People would sometimes tease Mobot for hardly moving from her computer, but this was why. The digital world offered her control. If bad things happened, they generally didn't involve gunfire and the threat of death. The gunman was first through the door, but he couldn't get a clear shot, and he and his two accomplices raced down the stairs in pursuit of Cy and Mobot, who bounced off the walls, taking the descent at a hazardous pace. Mobot stumbled at the top of the final flight, but Cy caught and steadied her, and together they raced toward the exit. They burst into a corridor that led to the lobby, and saw another pair of hostile eyes on them. They belonged to a man Mobot had noticed on the way in. Unshaven and wearing casual sportswear, he'd been unremarkable at first, but now was clearly identifiable as an enemy. He made straight for them through the crowded, opulent lobby. Mobot and Cy turned and ran the other way. They raced along a short corridor to a busy bar and restaurant, and flashed past a startled hostess standing beside a menu station. Mobot glanced behind them to see the trio led by the gunman burst through the stairwell door. The three angry, hostile men joined their accomplice in pursuit of Cy and Mobot. They danced around tables, servers, and ornate floral displays, running toward the kitchen doors. They hurtled through one marked entrée and found themselves in a huge, frantically busy catering kitchen, where staff were sweating their way through the afternoon service and prepping for dinner on the busiest week of the year. Mobot spotted an open door on the other side of the kitchen, which appeared to lead to a service corridor. "Come on!" she told Cy, and they ran toward the opening, ignoring yells from angry chefs whose fury intensified when the band of pursuers burst into the kitchen. Mobot heard the buzz of alarmed chatter from the dining room as the door swung back and forth, and she had no doubt hotel security and police would already be on their way. A gunshot rang out, and a bullet ricocheted off a pan rack. The cries of anger from the kitchen staff turned to exclamations of fear. The chefs and their assistants hurried to escape the danger and fled into the dining room. Another shot, this one close by, but Mobot and Cy were near the doorway now, and she could only focus on the light shining through. They had to make it. They were almost there. "Move!" Mobot shouted as she and Cy bundled through the open doorway to the safety of the corridor beyond. Chapter 68. Mobot and Cy stumbled into a service area. Above their heads, a large duct ran the length of the corridor. As they dashed on, breathless and exhausted, they saw doorways to their right. They sprinted past a series of offices before reaching an intersection with another corridor. They turned as their pursuers entered the corridor behind them, and the gunmen took a few potshots. The bullets hit the wall behind them as Cy led them down a branching corridor which opened out into a wider space. To their left was an office. To their right, a huge industrial laundry full of large washing machines and steaming presses. Ahead of them was a loading bay, and beyond the vehicle area was a raised roller shutter that opened onto the street. "Come on," Mobot told Cy, pushing him toward the loading bay. She glanced back to see the four gangsters enter the corridor. She and Cy ran through an archway into the vehicle area. She pushed him to the right and followed him, out of the path of the gunfire that whined through the air around them. "Jeez!" Cy exclaimed, jumping down from the loading platform into one of the vehicle bays. Mobot followed, and the two of them sprinted across the bay toward the roller shutter and the street beyond. They were inches away from escape. Mobot could see the Avenue de Grande Bretagne at the end of the alleyway that accessed the loading bay. They were going to come out very close to the cab rank that served the hotel. "Nearly there," Mobot told Cy breathlessly, and he nodded. There was another shot, but this time there was no ricochet or rush of whipped air as the bullet failed to find its mark. Instead, there was a quiet grunt from Cy, and a misstep that sent him lurching forward as they cleared the shutter. He stumbled and fell into the alleyway. Mobot realized he'd been shot in the back, near his right shoulder. The bloodstain was already spreading across his t-shirt. "Don't you stop on me!" she yelled, grabbing him. "Get up, Seymour!" She slipped her arm under his and was grateful when he pulled himself up. She couldn't have carried him. He smiled thinly, his face as pale as a cloud-covered winter sky. "I'm still here," he said, and together they staggered to the end of the alleyway. Mobot guided Cy toward the cab rank a short distance away, supporting him as they stumbled to the first vehicle. "We need to get my friend to hospital," she told the driver, who looked startled and afraid. Mobot followed his gaze, glancing over her shoulder to see the gunman emerge from the loading bay. She didn't wait for the driver to respond, opened the rear door, and shoved Cy inside. "Just get us to a hospital!" she yelled, stepping into the vehicle. She heard 2 shots and immediately registered 2 stabs of searing pain in her back, around her left kidney. She slumped forward onto Cy and heard the roar of an engine. She was vaguely aware of the cab moving off at speed, but she was on her own journey, one that tuned out life, color, and light, and sent her into inescapable darkness.
Chapter 69. Justine and I left the Fairmont Hotel. As we started west toward the apartment, I checked my phone and saw I'd missed a call from Mobot while we'd been in a loud party with Carver. I listened to her message as we picked our way along the crowded street, following the pedestrian walkway around the racetrack toward the seafront. "Mo and Cy have gone to follow up a lead," I told Justine. "Some guy called Kendrick Stamp?" "Any idea why?" she asked. I shook my head. Mobot didn't say. We hurried through the city. The sun was falling rapidly, and I was sure the coming of darkness would take the festivities to a new pitch. I wondered if locals liked the race, or whether it was viewed as an economic boom to be endured. Did they leave the city, make a bundle renting out their homes, and return when the kerfuffle had moved on to the next country on the Formula One tour? I imagined the race brought in tens of millions of dollars at a minimum, so expected there was general good feeling toward the event. The race fans thronging the city were already excited, and I wished I could be one of them, carelessly partying the night away. But I'd chosen a different path through life, one that took me into harm's way far too often, one that regularly meant my choices weren't my own. I looked at Justine, so beautiful, so intelligent, her face tight with stress. She deserved better than this, surely, even if I didn't feel I did. She should have a life of comfort and ease with someone who could make her the center of his world, someone whose mission in life wouldn't put her in danger. She caught me looking at her and smiled. The darkness in my heart faded a little, and I smiled back. My logical mind might believe I should surrender her to a better life, but my heart couldn't let her go. She was my world, and I loved her. 20 minutes later, we were back in the apartment. There was no sign of Mobot or Cy. I checked Mobot's workstation and found some information about a man called Kendrick Stamp. He was a former FBI agent who'd served as a scout sniper in the Marine Corps before joining the Bureau. But there was no indication of why Cy and Mobot were interested in this man. There was a hotel reservation in his name at the Metropole, which would explain the lead they were following up. I tried Mobot's phone, but there was no answer. Cy's also rang through to voicemail. By 6:30 p.m., Justine and I were starting to get worried. "I don't like this," I said, fidgeting restlessly by the dining table. Justine was flicking through the local channels looking for news. "They'll be okay," she assured me. But I could see the concern writ large on her face. "I think we should check the hospital," I said, "and go to the hotel, ask around, see if anyone has seen them. Talk to this Kendrick Stamp." "Jack," Justine said, pointing at the TV. She put the volume up on a news report in French. I couldn't understand the detail, but it was clearly giving details of a shooting outside the Hotel Metropole in Monaco earlier in the day. I caught the gist of a police appeal for witnesses and the fact the victims were 2 American tourists, but that the attack was targeted and there was no evidence there was a danger to anyone else. "You don't think," Justine began. I didn't get the chance to reply. My phone rang, and I answered immediately. "Mr. Morgan, this is Valerie Chevalier. Your colleagues Maureen Roth and Seymour Kloppenberg have been shot. They are in the Princess Grace Hospital receiving treatment. Their conditions are grave." "I'm on my way," I said, before hanging up. Justine looked at me expectantly, but it took me a moment to break the news because a pit had opened inside me and sucked all the sense and joy from life. "Their conditions are grave." I understood the significance of those words and could hardly cope with the horror of them being applied to my friends. Finally, I looked at Justine, my eyes wet. "Mo and Cy have been shot." Chapter 70. We almost ran to the hospital. The exertion was a welcome antidote to the numbness I'd felt in the apartment. I'd lost friends and comrades before, but familiarity didn't make the trauma of death any easier. Mobot and Sai hadn't gone, but the Grim Reaper had one hand on them. Police officers and government officials didn't use the word grave unless there was a serious risk of death, and my mind reeled at the prospect I could lose my friends. I'd been feeling guilty about Justine's abduction and my role in placing her in harm's way. But if I lost Mobot and Sai because of their association with me, I didn't know how I'd cope. For now, I channeled the guilt, fear, and frustration into a bottomless pit of anger at the men who'd done this to us, and most of all, Roman Verde, whom I was eager to confront. Our journey through the city, full of anxiety, anger, and dismay, was at odds with Monaco's mood, which was one of delirious excitement. As we headed toward whatever nightmare awaited us, parties were gathering momentum all around. Chevalier was waiting for us in the hospital, and I was glad because it was an obvious place for Roman Verde to target, knowing we'd be very likely to visit our colleagues. I had to assume his people were behind the shooting, and that he knew from the news reports that Sai and Mobot had survived. As Monaco's only public hospital, the Princess Grace would be a safe bet for their admission. "I'm so sorry," the inspector said, as we rushed through the main doors. "This way." She led us across the lobby, where 3 uniformed officers were posted. "You think there's an ongoing threat?" Justine asked. "Possibly," Chevalier replied. "To you as well as them. The police presence will discourage opportunist attacks." She took us to one of the private wards on the 5th floor. There was another cop by the elevator and a 5th standing guard on the ward itself. Chevalier nodded a greeting as we approached, and the officer stood to attention. "Mr. Kloppenberg is in there," she said, gesturing to a room on our right. "He's had emergency surgery." Justine gasped, and I felt hollow deep inside, my legs barely supporting me. I peered through the observation window and saw Sai, unconscious, connected to a plethora of monitors and IV drips. He looked in a bad way. "Oh, Sai," Justine said, taking my hand. In that moment, it took every ounce of self-control to prevent myself from breaking down. These were our friends. "Miss Roth is in here," Valerie said, signaling to the room directly opposite. Justine and I moved across the corridor. When we looked through the observation window, I was surprised and relieved to see Mobot was conscious. She had her head turned toward the exterior window, which gave her a view of the city and the starry night sky. She must have sensed movement, because she turned to us, smiled faintly, and beckoned us in. "The doctors say she cannot be disturbed for long," Chevalier informed us. "That's why I haven't taken her statement yet." "We'll be quick," I assured her, and she followed us inside. I'd never seen Mobot look so frail and vulnerable. Her skin was paper white, and her movements were shaky. "Excuse the mess," she said, gesturing at the various machines and drips surrounding her. "Mo," Justine responded, moving swiftly to her side. She took our friend's hand, the one without the cannula. "I'm so sorry." "I'll be all right, kiddo," Mobot said. Her voice was thin and small. I could already feel her creeping fatigue. "What happened?" I asked, leaning in. "We went to follow up a lead," Mobot said. "It turned out to be nothing, but some of Roman Verde's men spotted us in the street, and they shot us." I got the sense she wasn't telling the whole truth, and she didn't mention Kendrick's stamp at all. I guess there were things she didn't trust Valerie with. Mobot's attention drifted for a moment, and I couldn't tell whether it was from exhaustion or getting lost in the memory of trauma. "Is Sai okay?" she asked at last. "You don't need to worry about him," I told her. "He's in good hands. Just focus on yourself." She smiled. "Okay, Dad." "What was the lead?" Chevalier asked. "Oh, it was a ridiculous hunch I had about some of Roman's men using the hotel as a meeting place," Mobot replied. And I knew for sure she was trying to keep something from the inspector. "Maybe not so ridiculous," Chevalier remarked. "What made you think they might be there?" "I'm tired, Jack," Mobot replied. "So tired." "We should leave," I said. The inspector hesitated and then nodded reluctantly. "Feel better," Justine told Mobot before steering Valerie toward the door. "I will send a photofit artist when you are well enough," Valerie told Mobot. She and Justine left the room. Mo, I want you to, I began, but she cut me off, suddenly more alert. If you tell me to focus on myself, she interrupted, or to concentrate on getting better, I'll kick your butt into the next room. There was fire in her eyes. My body will do what it needs to do to heal. I want you to get the men who did this to us, Mobot said. I guess we're still not fully trusting the cops after the obvious corruption and security breaches? I nodded. That's why I didn't mention Kendrick Stamp. He's at the Metropole, room 408. I think he's the second assassin Roman talked about. In fact, I'm pretty certain of it. He told me he was being watched before we were attacked. His number and yours were the only ones on a SIM Philippe Duval had hidden in his safe. Stamp is married and got really cagey when we asked about his wife. I think Roman and his men have her. I took her hand and squeezed it gently. You did good work, I said. Don't praise me, Jack. That's not what I need, she replied, her eyes filling in a rare display of vulnerability. Find the men who did this. Find them and make sure they answer for what they've done. Promise me. I nodded. I promise. Chapter 71. I saw Chevalier and Justine watching us through the observation window, and their eyes stayed on me as I left Mobot's room. What did she say? The inspector asked after I'd shut the door. She wanted me to pass on some messages to her team, I replied, and family. Chevalier frowned. Do you know why they went to the Metropole? She asked. I shook my head. I was going to leave it at that, but I was angry at what had happened to my friends and the way we'd been treated since arriving in the city. I stepped closer to Chevalier. We found evidence Philippe Duval was working with the men who shot Mo and Cy, I said. My government is looking at it right now. I caught Justine's startled expression and the side-eye from the uniformed cop posted guard. What? Philippe? Chevalier exclaimed in what seemed like genuine disbelief. What evidence have you? We can't share it with you just yet, I told her. If your interior minister was compromised, former interior minister, she said, this was going on while he was in government, I revealed. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she finally said, So, you don't think you can trust us? No, I replied, nor the French police. 2 cops helped the Automobile Club suspect escape arrest. Justine has the footage. Chevalier looked at Justine, who nodded. Can you send it to me? She asked. I nodded, and Justine said, Yes, I'll message you a download link. If what you say is true, then these people have infiltrated institutions we should be able to trust, the inspector remarked. Exactly, I agreed. If an interior minister can be compromised and officers induced to break the law, then you'll understand why we're wary of the authorities. My people are, she began, but I interrupted her. Honest? Trustworthy? Can you really vouch for everyone who works for you? I asked. We'll share the evidence when we know it's safe. In the meantime, you need to reassess the people you trust. Valerie Chevalier looked punch-drunk, but there was nothing more to say. Justine and I left her dealing with the implications of our revelations while we walked to the elevator. Minutes later, we were outside the hospital amid the sights, sounds and smells of a city heading for new heights of revelry. What now? Justine asked, when we were well clear of the building. We go to the Hotel Metropole. Mobot thinks Kendrick Stamp is the second assassin, former Marine, scout sniper, and FBI special agent, I said. So, he has the skills. What if Roman's people are still there? Justine asked. I hope we run into them, I replied grimly. 20 minutes later, after navigating the crowded streets, we stepped into the grand lobby of the Metropole, which showed no signs of any shooting. The large atrium was packed with new arrivals waiting to check in. Others had spilled out of the bar and were holding drinks, talking and laughing animatedly. We went directly to the elevators and took one to the 4th floor. We found room 408 and I knocked on the door. I could hear the TV playing inside, but there was no other sound. After a couple beats, I knocked again. Justine wandered idly along the corridor until something stopped her in her tracks. Jack, come and look at this. She beckoned me over, and as I approached, I realized she was pointing at a bullet hole in the plush wallpaper on the far side of the stairwell door. Do you think the cops even know about it? I shook my head. There would be a slug in that wall, but knowing what I knew about the dark fates and propaganda tray, I was almost certain it wouldn't lead to a traceable gun. Still, the police should at least analyze all the available evidence and try to piece together a trail. "Tell Chevalier about it when you send the footage you took in La Tourbie," I said, and Justine nodded. I returned to room 408 and knocked for a third time. After another couple beats, I glanced along the corridor and, seeing it was clear, barged the door open with my shoulder. There was a loud crack as it split from the frame, and another bang as it swung wide and slammed against the stopper. Justine and I hurried into the room to find the TV on, but the room empty. The closets were devoid of clothes, and there was no sign of habitation anywhere. A 20-euro bill on the pillow spoke to a decent character, but also suggested Kendrick Stamp had checked out. I picked up the house phone and made a call. "Reception," a man said. "This is Mark from housekeeping," I replied. "I just want to confirm Mr. Stamp from room 408 checked out early." There was a brief pause. "Yes, he settled his bill a couple of hours ago. It's marked on the turn-down rota." "I see it now. Thank you." I hung up and turned to Justine. "He skipped. They must have moved him after the shooting." Chapter 72. I was seething by the time we returned to the apartment, and I suspected Justine shared my mood because she said nothing on the journey back. Our friends were lying somewhere between life and death, while the men who'd put them there roamed free, able to inflict further evil on the world. The apartment seemed lifeless without Mobot and Cy. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of them. Cy's spare boots, Mobot's reading glasses. I felt angry at the men who'd hurt them, but also furious at myself for having failed to protect them. "You want something to eat?" Justine asked. I shook my head. "I'm not hungry." I sat down at Mobot's workstation and used the emergency password she'd given me in case anything ever happened to her. The screens came to life, and I saw she'd received a message from Weaver. He'd provided a full breakdown of who was behind the Chalmont casino, and his network analysis concluded the business wasn't entirely legitimate. I printed off 2 copies of the analysis and handed one to Justine. She sat next to me as we went through the document. We also reviewed the information Mobot and Cy had pulled on Kendrick Stamp. We spent hours poring over everything, occasionally rising to make each other coffee and grab chips and snacks as the rage-fueled adrenaline wore off and was replaced by hunger. "Listen to this," Justine said, as I returned with a fresh cup of steaming Java. Kendrick Stamp received a bureau commendation for international cooperation. Intelligence he provided was used by French police to bust a drugs gang. The bust resulted in multiple arrests. "Where was this?" I asked. "You don't think it was the Marseille bust involving Roman?" I sat down at Mobot's machine and messaged Weaver to ask if he could provide details of the investigation that had led to Kendrick's commendation. "That would give the Dark Fates a personal grudge against him," Justine remarked, "like they have against us." I nodded and continued reviewing the Chalmont network analysis while I waited for a reply from Weaver. As I looked at the document, I realized I'd missed something that had been staring me in the face since the intelligence analyst had emailed across the information. "There's a small shareholder in Chalmont called Enterprises du Soleil," I said, showing Justine the corporate records. "So?" she asked. "Look at the address for Enterprises du Soleil," I suggested. I used Mobot's computer to search the address, and it displayed a mountainside in southern France, the Utel Valley. The pin dropped on the high farmhouse, the one where Justine had been held hostage. She looked at me in disbelief. "So we've got proof Raymond Chalmont is tied to these people." An alert sounded, notifying us of a new message from Weaver. "Easy question," he wrote. "Kendrick Stamp was on a joint DEA-FBI task force that picked up intelligence of a major heroin deal going down in Marseille. He advised the Marseille police, who arrested a gangland kingpin called Baba Saidi. Stamp received a commendation for his work. It was his last big investigation before he was signed off sick." "We know the Dark Fates have connections in the French police," I said to Justine, "which means Roman could probably have identified the source of the intelligence that led to his arrest and the disruption of the deal, giving him a personal motive for revenge." "Putting Stamp in the firing line," Justine remarked. I nodded. You got the energy for a drive? I asked. I want to check something out. Chapter 73. We didn't speak as I followed the road up the Utel Valley. The Ford Kuga's engine strained against the steep inclines, and its tires churned up gravel from the surface. The clatter of loose stones against the chassis and the growl of the engine were the only sounds as we climbed higher up the mountainside. The headlamps sliced a wedge of light into the nothingness of night. I stuck to the center of the road, avoiding the sheer drops and hairpin turns, the deep ravines spanned by narrow bridges. I remembered how close we'd come to death on this mountain, and how narrowly we'd escaped the bullets sent our way by the men who'd made Sai and Mobot targets. Seeing them in hospital had shaken me and reminded me just how vulnerable we all were. Skill and luck had been my allies then, but what would happen if they deserted me? "What if there's someone there now?" Justine asked, bringing me out of my maudlin self-reflection. "Then we'll turn back," I replied. Chevalier had told us the place was deserted by the time the police had arrived. "I won't let anything happen to us," I assured Justine. She smiled at me. "I don't need you to protect me, Jack. You know that. I just wanted us to have a plan. I hesitated. I wasn't sure what she was getting at. "You don't have to carry the responsibility for saving me," she explained. "I'm my own person. I can assess risk for myself, and if I make a mistake, it's on me to fix it." "Is this a rage against the patriarchy?" I asked. "Because I'm not your white knight. I don't view it as me saving you. I see it as us saving each other. We look out for each other because we both care. Equality." She looked a little contrite. "I guess I just wanted to be clear. I don't want you carrying me as well as everything and everyone else. If you're carrying me and I'm carrying you, no one's carrying a burden," I said. "Confucius?" "Jack Morgan," I replied with a smile. I got what she was saying, but there was no way I was going to stop protecting her. It was ingrained in me to look after others, but I wasn't going to press the issue. She looked after me too. So did Sai and Mobot. I'd lost count of the number of times my life had been saved by others. It wasn't an admission of weakness. It was a recognition of the hazards we faced in our line of work. We were almost at the farm, so I pulled over at the next turnout and killed the engine. "We go on foot from here." I changed into jeans, a t-shirt, and a lightweight racer jacket, which I fastened against the cool wind blowing up the valley. Justine was in black trousers and a matching roll neck. We set out through the trees toward the farmhouse. I stayed alert for any signs of patrols or sentries, but there was nothing except the unpredictable sounds of nature. An owl, something scurrying in the undergrowth, branches creaking, leaves rustling. We moved quickly toward the cobblestone courtyard, and I saw Justine eye the building where she'd been held hostage. The door was open, but neither of us moved toward it. Instead, we headed for the main house, its roof partially burned by the incendiary drones Sai had rigged and dropped during Justine's escape. There were no signs of life, no vehicles in the yard, and no lights or indications of activity in the building. The front door stood open. I went first, using a small torch to light our way. It pushed back the shadows to reveal a largely empty property. There was no art or decoration of any kind, just plain painted walls and functional furniture. The main living room was full of bunks, which were all unmade, and a couple mattresses had been tossed on the floor. The kitchen contained a large farmhouse table surrounded by more than a dozen chairs, and I pictured Justine's abductors in here together, eating, laughing and joking, or perhaps grimly plotting murder, while she was trapped in the small store outside. What pushed men like them to normalize such evil? We continued through the house, moving upstairs to find more bunks, and finally the master bedroom with one king-size bed. I guessed this was where Roman Verde slept, a perk of leadership. The bed was unmade, and the closets were bare. But when we checked the bathroom, we found evidence of a fire that was nothing to do with the burned roof because the ceiling above was still intact. A small metal trash can stood in the center of the room, its sides blackened. I looked in the can and found the charred remains of papers. Most had been burned to ash, but a few might be recoverable. Carefully, I gathered as many fragments as I could and held them gently in a stack. "I think this is it," I said. The cops must have taken everything else for analysis, or there wasn't anything here when they were looking. I don't think we're going to find anything else. Justine nodded. We should go. Happy to, I replied. She'd masked it well, but I could tell the return to the place where she'd been held prisoner had been hard on her. You're safe, I assured her as we left the room. I know, she said, but I didn't feel the tension leave her until we were in the car, heading down the mountain. Chapter 74. By the time we returned to the apartment, Monaco was finally asleep. The streets were empty and devoid of crowds. I got a more complete sense of just how much the race altered the city. The diversions, signs, barriers, specially constructed walkways, elevated tunnels, hoardings, stands, and temporary buildings stood out as transient additions to the small Mediterranean principality. Justine took care of the charred documents while I drove us back. When we entered the apartment, we laid them out on the table. I went to Sai's gear bag and took out one of his traveling crime scene kits. I found a processing pan and prepared a solution of 2 parts water, 5 parts alcohol, and 3 parts glycerin, which I added to the pan. The chemical cocktail was designed to strip away the charring, to reveal anything written or printed on the burned paper we'd recovered. The process involved the destruction of the documents, but in the absence of a full lab, it was the best way to retrieve whatever information Roman or his associates might have been trying to destroy. Justine and I worked methodically, placing each fragment of paper in the solution. We watched them absorb the liquid, sink, and then disintegrate, and after each iteration, I would drain the pan, clean it, and prepare a new bath for the next document. The first 5 pieces of paper gave us nothing. They were either blank or contained generic words or numbers that had no special significance, but the 6th and final piece gave up something useful. First came a logo, Port Hercules Fuel Depot, followed by details of a transaction, 500 liters of marine diesel, invoiced to a boat that had been fueled the previous week. I used my phone to take a photograph of the information. They have a boat, Justine remarked. Kendrick's stamp was a scout sniper, I replied. They gave me an undetectable pistol for a close kill. It makes sense to have a long-range shooter as backup, different method in case I was compromised. You think he'd be able to take a shot from a boat? Justine asked. Why not? Why else would they need one? And why try to destroy this invoice if it wasn't important? I watched the fragment of paper sink to the bottom of the pan and begin to disintegrate. What now? I shrugged. I don't know. Do we trust the cops with this, or if we tell them, do we run the risk of the information leaking, forcing the assassin to switch to a different method? It would be easier if we knew the target, Justine remarked. Until we know otherwise, I'm going to assume it's Eli Carver, I told her, aware I had nothing but the fact I was close to the man and Duval's sharing of intel to support my hunch. If we can get to the fuel depot, we can use the invoice number to identify the vessel. I searched my phone for the details of the filling station at Port Hercules and discovered it opened at 7 a.m. I'm going to make sure I'm there first thing, I said. We should get some rest in the meantime, Justine suggested. You look beat. I shook my head. I'm fine. I'm going to stay up a while and review everything. I can't help feeling there's something we missed. Justine pulled up a chair next to me. Don't, I said. Hey, what's good for the gander is good for the goose, she said with a smile. Mo and Sai are family to me too, and I want to do whatever I can to catch the men responsible. I took her hand and squeezed it. We kissed tenderly before getting back to work. Chapter 75. I woke with a start, suddenly aware of noise rising from the street. In the distance, I could hear powerful engines roaring like wild animals. I was lying with my head on the dining table and must have fallen asleep where I had been working. I sat up and checked my watch, dismayed at my failure to stay awake. It was 8:30 a.m. The fuel depot had been open for 90 minutes. I looked around and saw Justine asleep on one of the couches. Jus? I said, moving toward her. She stirred as I leaned down to kiss her. Justine, come on, I said. We fell asleep. Oh, my God, she exclaimed with a start. Oh, no, what time is it? 8:30, I replied. We need to get moving. It sounds like they're warming up for qualifying. Nothing can prepare a person for the sound of a Formula One car. And the noise of the state-of-the-art machines dominated the city. Justine nodded and stretched as she stood up. I'm sorry, she said. I just had to sleep. Turns out I did too. You find anything? She asked, gesturing to the mass of paper spread across the table. I don't even know, I replied. It all became a blur. I returned to the table and looked at the evidence we'd amassed from our investigation into Duval. I picked up the messages we'd pulled off the 4 phones we'd found in his safe. One device had contained a peculiar set of messages sent by him over the course of a year, a series of numeric codes. I don't know whether it was the benefit of sleep or a little distance from the intense focus I'd applied to them, but I finally saw a pattern in them. The first 11 numbers were repeated in each message. What is it? Justine asked, joining me. These texts, I replied. I think I can crack the code. I grabbed a blank piece of paper and wrote out the first 11 numbers. 217, 161, 31316. I assumed it was an alphanumeric and that the larger numbers referred to letters further into the alphabet. Through a process of trial and error, I broke the sequence into 2-17-16-13-13-16, and then tried to fit letters to each one. After a few minutes, I realized it was a simple +1 code that read, Apollo. What's Eli Carver's Secret Service code name? I asked, and Justine grabbed her phone to search the internet. According to a Rolling Stone profile, Secretary Carver has mixed feelings about his code name, Justine read from the article. Because he isn't quite as fleet of foot as the Greek god Apollo? I bet this is information Duval was supplying on him, I said. Can you send these messages to Weaver while I call Carver? Justine nodded and sat at Mobot's workstation. I dialed the secretary's personal line. Yes, a woman said. Secretary Carver, please. One moment. The line went silent. Then I heard heavy breathing and the sound of sheets rustling. Mr. Morgan, this is Henry Wilson. How can I help you? I need to speak to the secretary. Well, Secretary Carver has given strict D&D orders, he replied. D&D? Do not disturb. He'll surface just before qualifying, I imagine. You're very welcome to join us. I have reason to believe the secretary is a target. We discovered... He cut me off. Mr. Morgan, we've discussed this. We found text messages on a conspirator's phone that mentioned the name Apollo. I haven't been able to decipher the rest of the coded messages, but that's the secretary's code name, isn't it? There was a moment's hesitation. Mr. Morgan, do you have any idea how many threats the Secret Service addresses every single day? Do you know how sophisticated our threat matrix is? I don't give a damn, I replied, allowing my frustration to get the better of me. I wish I'd controlled my emotions more effectively, because I must have sounded a little unhinged. I'm telling you, this is a real and present threat. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Morgan. I'll inform the head of the Secretary's detail. I do hope we'll see you later. And with that, he hung up on me. That son of a... I said. I've sent the messages to Weaver, Justine responded, but he probably won't see them for hours. It's the middle of the night on the East Coast. What do we do now? We're going to have to split up, I replied. I want you to find Carver. Make him listen to you. He'll be at the grandstand overlooking the Louis Chiron. It's one of the most famous features of the course. Oh, what are you going to do? I'm going to the port to find the boat Roman is using, I said. If you can't get Carver and his people to listen, we're going to need to stop this ourselves.
Chapter 76. Justine walked with Jack as far as the corner of Avenue du Port and Boulevard Albert Premier. The city was packed with race fans being channeled along the temporary walkways and tunnel bridges. The noise of the crowd and race cars being prepped and tuned was deafening. The atmosphere before qualifying already rivaled the excitement of any event Justine had experienced. So she struggled to picture what the energy of the city would be like for the race the next day. But she couldn't get caught up in the anticipation and enthusiasm. She had other things on her mind. Be careful, Jack said before giving her a kiss. You too, she replied. He headed south, climbing steps to a tunnel bridge that would take him to the Grand Port and Marina, full to bursting with luxury yachts. Justine went east toward the race command center and the Louis Chiron, the infamous chicane located nearby, directly opposite the port. The first roaring Formula One car racing along the city streets told Justine qualifying was underway. In between the sound of gear changes came the cheers of crowds in the grandstands and gathered around the city. She headed for the Monte Carlo casino stand, which was located opposite the Louis Chiron. Carver had told Jack that's where he'd be, and as Justine worked her way through the crowded walkways and neared the location, she could see why the defense secretary had chosen this stand to watch the race from. It was in a magnificent setting on a tight bend that forced the powerful cars to slow in front of the spectators before rocketing onto the next straight. The stand was set tight against the bend, so the people in the front row might believe they could reach out and touch the cars, putting them in the action, rather than consigning them to merely spectating. Justine surveyed the stand at a distance, but couldn't make out Carver, so she approached an entry gate and joined a small group of people looking to get into this section of the race. She was soon at the front, facing an admissions marshal. "Pass?" he said. "I don't have one," Justine replied. "I just need to talk to someone in the casino stand." "You can't enter without a pass," the marshal said. Justine suddenly remembered Carver had invited them to be his guests. "I have a pass, but it's with my friend," she responded. "He invited me." "If your friend has arranged a pass," the marshal said, "it will be available for collection at a ticket kiosk." He gestured toward a row of white huts on the other side of the pedestrian walkway. "Simply present your passport or identification card." "Thank you," she said before joining a line for one of the booths. 10 minutes later, after making it to the front of the line and presenting her passport, she was given her pass. She went back to the gate and this time was allowed in. As she crossed a footbridge to take her to the grandstand, Justine's senses were assailed by the roar of a race car passing beneath her, the smell of high-grade fuel, and the cries of the crowd. She hurried on, eager to reach Carver before it was too late.
Chapter 77. I felt uncomfortable leaving Justine, but our team was short of people, and I wanted to make sure Eli Carver was fully informed of the threat. The route to the marina was crowded and took in more loops and turns than would have been normal so as to avoid the racetrack, the temporary media center, and stands around the edge of the port. I could hear a car tearing around the track, engine screeching at the upper end of the revs, the vibrations so forceful I felt it touch my bones. It was something no television or home speaker could convey. The sheer body-trembling power of the vehicle was awesome and sufficiently loud to drown out the cheering of the crowds it passed. I pressed my way through the crush of slow-moving pedestrians and finally managed to turn off the main walkway serving the marina berths and towards the fuel depot. There wasn't a single empty mooring, and shoals of tenders skimmed across the water carrying people from vessels anchored in the bay to the shore and vice versa. The yachts closest to the promenade were full of spectators on their highest decks, trying to get a good view of qualifying. When I glanced over my shoulder, I could see the Monte Carlo casino stand in the distance, but I wasn't able to pick out Eli Carver or Justine on any of the balconies. I hurried along the main jetty toward the branching pontoon that was home to the fueling station. There were 2 attendants dressed in smart navy blue overalls. One was filling the fuel tank of a Beneteau motor yacht, while the other stood by a small office and watched. "Oui?" the unoccupied man said to me. "Do you speak English?" I asked, and the man nodded. "I need to know about a boat that refueled here last week," I said. "Invoice number 1619. "Why?" he asked. "I'm a detective," I replied. "They owe a client of mine some money." The man frowned. "I'm willing to pay for the information," I told him, producing my wallet. "I'm a friend of justice," he replied with open arms. "Invoice number 1619, I repeated. He sauntered into the office and picked up a ledger. He removed his sunglasses and flipped the pages until finally settling on one. "Oh, yes," he said. "I can't believe they owe money. They didn't give a gratuity." I took 25 euros from my wallet and handed them to him. "The yacht is called the Sunset Prince," he revealed. "It left port a few days ago, probably moved along the coast." I frowned. That was not what I expected. "Are you certain?" He nodded. "I saw it leave." "Thank you," I said, before turning to go. I wondered what to do now. "That's not true," his colleague said, looking up from the fuel tank he was filling. "They left, but they took a mooring in the bay. I saw them on my way in this morning." He nodded toward a rib with a single 150-horsepower Yamaha outboard engine. "Where?" I asked. "Southeast, maybe half a kilometer offshore," he replied. Well within sniper range for a good marksman. He stopped filling the tank and stepped away from the motorboat, leading me to the edge of the pontoon. "Over there, you can just see the black and white navigation unit," he said, pointing into the distance. As I peered through the forest of masts, I could make out the satellite array he was talking about. It belonged to a large motor yacht. "How much to charter your rib?" I asked, and the two fuel attendants exchanged a look that told me we were about to start negotiating.
Chapter 78. Justine hurried along the walkway toward the Monte Carlo casino stand, but was stopped by a man in a dark gray suit. His large build, aviator sunglasses, buzz cut, stars and stripes pin, and Marie transceiver in his left ear all screamed Secret Service. "Ma'am, this stand is off limits," he yelled above the thunderous roar of an approaching race car. His Texan accent was another giveaway. "I'm a guest of Secretary Carver," Justine said. She craned to peer around the man, but couldn't get a view of the stand. Just the steps that led to the seating area. "Name, please," he responded automatically, producing a tablet computer. "Justine Smith." He checked the device and frowned. "I'm afraid your invitation to be in the Secretary's party has been rescinded, ma'am," he revealed. "I'm sorry. You'll need to make your way to another part of the course." Justine stood in stunned disbelief for a moment. "Ma'am, you'll need to move along." She couldn't understand why Carver would retract her invitation. "What about Jack Morgan? Is he still on the list?" she asked. "Ma'am, I can't share any details about other people in the Secretary's party," he replied. "I have to ask you to move along, please." Justine found herself eyeing the stand. She couldn't have been more than 40 feet from the steps, and thought about pushing past the huge guy and making a run for it. But there were 2 more agents by the grandstand, and she had no doubt the men were armed and would shoot her if they deemed her a threat. "Could you check with Secretary Carver?" she said. "I think there's been some mistake." The thunder of the engines, clamor of the crowd, and wild atmosphere made the conversation even more difficult and fraught. "I can't do that, ma'am," the agent replied loudly. "The list doesn't make mistakes." "I saw the Secretary yesterday," Justine said. "He reiterated his invitation. Why would he have done that?" The Secret Service agent shrugged. "I can't answer for the Secretary, ma'am." "Could you please check for me?" she asked again. "I really do think there's been a mistake." He set his jaw, and his tone turned darker. "You need to move along, ma'am." Justine glanced around desperately and saw a familiar face coming along the walkway. Henry Wilson, Carver's aide, was talking on his phone. His jovial expression fell away momentarily when he saw Justine, but he recovered with a quick, false smile. She wondered why she was suddenly unwelcome. Was it because she and Jack had warned of danger? Were they regarded as obsessive alarmists? "Ms. Smith," Henry said a little too sweetly, "I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you had your hands full." "I need to talk to the Secretary," she told him, "but this gentleman says my invitation has been rescinded." "We reviewed the Secretary's security protocols on your recommendation and pared the guest list down to the absolute minimum," Henry replied. "Does he know?" Justine said. The aide didn't respond. "Does he know? Or did you do this?" Henry drew close. "Ms. Smith, please, don't cause a scene. The Secretary doesn't need the scandal associated with your abduction and alarmist talk of conspiracy with the dark fates, propaganda Tre, and Roman Verdi." Justine stepped back and studied him. "Who told you about Roman Verdi?" she asked. "The Secretary. It was in the intel you sent him, Henry replied, but he seemed flustered. His schedule had to have been leaked by someone close to him, Justine remarked. Oh, come now, he scoffed. You don't seriously think. Please don't draw me into your web of insanity. Show me your arm, Justine said and lunged for him. Show it to me. He stepped back. I don't know what's got into you, Miss Smith, but this is precisely why you were removed from the list. He turned to the Secret Service agent. Get her out of here. Eject her from the course and take her pass. Now. The huge guy grabbed Justine, who screamed and fought against him as he marched her toward the exit. Her cries were lost beneath the cacophony of the race, and hardly anyone noticed her being taken away.
Chapter 79. The Yamaha 150 outboard growled as I piloted the rib through the port. The yacht berths were jam-packed port to starboard and bow to stern. The bay beyond was smooth as a boating lake. The popularity of the race was advantageous to me because all the vessels gave me useful cover as I took a circuitous route to the Sunset Prince. I steered the rib on a wide, sweeping arc west, keeping as many boats as possible between me and the large motor yacht that was now my target. My aim was to approach the vessel from its port side because I figured if there was a shooter on board, all eyes would be on the race and the open water side would be less likely to be watched. I could hear the roar of engines in the distance, the rising and falling cheers of the crowds, and from the decks nearby came the excited shouts of people watching qualifying from their boats. I hoped Justine had reached Carver, but couldn't count on him or his people to take the threat seriously. I turned north toward the Sunset Prince, a blue and white Beneteau 46 powerboat with 4 decks. I couldn't see any obvious signs of a shooter, but I was coming at the vessel from the wrong side of the action. When I was 50 feet away, I cut the rib's outboard engine and ran silent, allowing momentum to carry me toward the stern of the Sunset Prince. Despite being within the confines of the bay, the large yacht bobbed on the waves, which would make any shot a challenge, even for an accomplished marksman. If he was on the other side of this vessel, Kendrick Stamp must have been utterly desperate to agree to do this. Roman Verdi must have some powerful hold over him, and given the man's M.O. in our case, Mobot was probably right to think they had Stamp's wife hostage. Momentum and tide carried me into the swimming platform attached to the stern of the yacht. I jumped onto the wooden decking and secured the rib's line to a cleat before climbing a short ladder and boarding the vessel. "Hey!" a man yelled as I climbed over the stanchions. I turned to see a heavy-set guy coming from below deck, up a gangway that led to the cabins. I rushed him before he reached the top of the stairs and kicked his torso, sending him tumbling down into the galley below. He cracked his head against the wooden floor, and his eyes rolled back before he passed out. I hurried to the starboard side and peered around the bulkhead to see Kendrick Stamp on the high deck above the pilot's wheel. In front of him was a Macmillan TAC-50 sniper rifle, a sophisticated long-range gun with telescopic sight. It was mounted on a platform with side panels that concealed it from casual observers, and the platform itself was constantly moving, powered by gyroscopic servos that compensated for the movement of the boat on the water. It was an expensive, state-of-the-art gun and stabilizing system. With this equipment, I had no doubt a man like Stamp would be able to assassinate Eli Carver.
Chapter 80. Justine struggled against the large Secret Service agent, but it was hopeless. He had hold of her left wrist and had twisted it behind her back into a position that inflicted immediate pain if she deviated even slightly from where he was directing her. Any further pressure, and she feared her wrist might snap. They were moving away from the grandstand toward the nearest exit across a raised walkway. The celebratory atmosphere, roaring cars, and excited crowds meant no one paid them any attention. Justine became increasingly desperate, but fought a sense of panic, which she knew could only steer her down the wrong path. Even as she was led away from her objective, with no way back to warn Carver, plus the nagging suspicion Henry Wilson was working for the enemy, she tried to find calm. "What's your name?" she asked, raising her voice to be heard above the din. Her captor remained silent. Justine's mind whirred frantically, but she fought the tumult of fears and frustrations and reminded herself that the truth was the most powerful weapon. Good people recognized the truth when it was plainly spoken. "You know my name is Justine Smith. I work for Private, the detective agency run by Jack Morgan." She glanced over her shoulder and saw a glimmer of recognition in the man's eyes. "You know that name. I bet everyone on the Secretary's detail knows that name because Jack saved your principal's life at Fallon Air Base in Nevada." The agent's grip on her wrist loosened slightly. "Jack is out there right now." Justine nodded toward the port. "He's looking for a shooter we believe is targeting the Secretary. And I think Henry Wilson is one of his co-conspirators." The agent stopped moving and let go of Justine. She rubbed her arm as she turned to face him. "Ma'am, do you have any idea how crazy this sounds?" "I don't care how it sounds," she replied, having to yell to make herself heard over the noise of the race. "I care about Secretary Carver's life. You need to take me back so I can talk to him." The agent's expression hardened. "Or don't, but have his detail move him. Get him to a less exposed location and keep him away from Wilson." Justine saw the conflict in the Secret Service agent. If she was an alarmist, he would face embarrassment and censure. But if what she was saying was true, the alternative would be catastrophic. The death of the man this agent was sworn to keep safe. "This is a serious threat," she said. "Don't let the bad guys win." "My name is Greg Campbell," he said at last, "and I think you'd better talk to the Secretary yourself."
Chapter 81. I started up the gangway toward Kendrick, but was surprised by a man who thrust a pistol in my face. It was Michel, the man I'd chased from the automobile club. His face was twisted into a vicious snarl. "Up," he said, "slowly." He stepped back and allowed me to climb the narrow steps that led to the pilot's deck. I moved at a deliberate, steady pace. "Up," he said, gesturing at another short run of steps that would take me to Kendrick's Stamp. I did as Michel said. As I reached the upper deck, Stamp looked around. He seemed haunted, and I could sense the conflict within him. He didn't want to be there, and his eyes blazed with hatred when Michel climbed the stairs to join us, his gun on me the whole time. We had a clear line of sight to the Monte Carlo Casino grandstand from up here, and I watched the crowd rise from their seats as a qualifying car sped round the Louis Chiron bend. Michel approached me, brandishing his gun. "You've caused nothing but trouble." "You don't have to do this, Kendrick," I said to Stamp. My attempted intervention earned me a smack from the gun, which made the world turn white with pain and set my ears ringing. Once the pain had subsided, I stood tall and glared at Michel. "Take this shot," he ordered Stamp, "or your wife dies." He produced a cell phone. "One call from me, and you'll never see her again," Michel said. "You want to live with the guilt of knowing you could have saved her?" Kendrick looked at me, and his eyes welled with tears. I could see the turmoil within him. Like me, this man had devoted his life to protecting and serving others. His record in the Marine Corps and FBI suggested someone with a strong sense of right and wrong. Being faced with this choice must have been tearing at his soul. "Don't take the shot," I said. "We can find Angie and get her back." Kendrick frowned at my use of his wife's name, and Michel hit me again. This time he opened up a nasty gash on my forehead, and, as blood ran into my right eye, I felt the pull of unconsciousness. I fell to my knees and put out a hand to steady myself. The world swam, and the pain was excruciating, but I rode the waves of agony until they settled. Kendrick Stamp looked down at me. I saw nothing but conflict in his eyes. This was a good man torn between doing what was right and what was necessary. I locked eyes with him and shook my head slowly. Tears overflowed and wet his cheeks as he turned to face the shore. He wiped his face before pressing his right eye to the scope. "You can watch your friend, the Secretary of Defense, die," Michel said to me, "and then I'll send you to hell to join him." He pressed the muzzle of the pistol to my temple. He would kill me the moment Kendrick hit the target.
Chapter 82. Secret Service agent Greg Campbell made good on his word and led Justine back to the entrance to the stand. "She's good," he said to the two agents posted by the stairs, and they nodded him and Justine through. "Thank you for doing this," she said as they started up the steps. "You'd better be on the level," Greg replied. "I am," Justine assured him. They went up and over the rear of the stand, and when they reached the top of a run of steps on the other side, Justine got a proper view of the Louis Chiron chicane and the port beyond. It was a magnificent spot from which to watch the race, which was also broadcast on two big screens set a short distance away from either side of the stand. "He's down at the front," Greg said. He took hold of Justine's arm, gently this time. "You'd better not be a nut." "I'm not," she replied, and he released her and followed as she started down the steps. She saw Eli Carver in the very first row, glancing around excitedly. The next car was approaching the bend, and Justine felt the phenomenal vibration of its engine as it neared. There was a roar as the car changed gears, and a magnificent Formula One car entered the Louis Chiron chicane in front of the grandstand. For a moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist as the sound and presence of the supercar cast everything else into shadow and silence. Reality only returned when it growled by, shifting gears as it sped out of the turn. Justine's eyes flicked from the fast-disappearing car to Eli Carver, but she caught someone else looking directly at her. Henry Wilson sitting 2 seats away from his boss. "What's she doing here?" he yelled. "Get her away from the secretary!" The sound of the cheering crowd died away, and Henry's voice seemed loud in the lull that followed. "I said get her out of here!" Carver turned and was initially puzzled to see Henry shouting at Justine. He looked from one to the other, bemused. "What's going on?" "Mr. Secretary, this person is a threat to your—" Henry began, but Justine cut him off. "Eli," she said, making a conscious decision to use familiarity to remind him of their friendship. "We have reason to believe there is an imminent threat on your life. Jack is—" Justine didn't get the chance to complete her sentence. There were 2 loud cracks as a pair of bullets struck the grandstand directly below where Carver was sitting. Justine only recognized them as gunshots because she was expecting violence. But most of the nearby spectators looked around in confusion, and people a few rows away from Carver didn't even register what had happened because of the general noise and commotion. Carver's Secret Service detail knew exactly what had happened. The agent nearest the defense secretary leaped to protect him and yelled, "Shots fired! Shots fired!" Another agent shouted, "We gotta get Apollo to the secondary location!" Justine felt Greg's hands on her arms. He steered her toward the guard that had suddenly formed around Carver. She felt herself being swept away, following the phalanx out of the stand through a side exit at the end of the front row. Events had moved beyond her control, but at least Carver was safe for now. She hoped the same was true of Jack.
Chapter 83. "You missed!" Michel said bitterly, and his face reddened with fury as he watched the commotion on the grandstand. I couldn't make out the details, but I was pretty sure the press of bodies was Carver's close protection detail taking him to safety. Kendrick Stamp unclipped the rifle from the gyroscopic platform and turned it on Michel. "I missed that target," he agreed, "but I won't miss this one." He pulled the trigger and shot Michel in the chest. The force of the high-caliber slug, delivered at deafeningly close range, drove Michel across the deck, and he collapsed against the other side, pawing weakly at the hole in his chest. Stamp put the rifle down and helped me to my feet. "Thank you," I said. His eyes shimmered with tears. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for my wife." "I appreciate it nonetheless," I told him. "I missed on purpose. I couldn't do it. I couldn't shoot him. I swore an oath." He hesitated. "Help me find her, please." "Do you have any leads?" He nodded. "They let me speak to her this morning. I was hooded, but she was there with me, in person, in a house or warehouse. It was definitely inside. I felt the breeze when they took me out afterwards." "Any ideas on the locality?" I asked, wiping blood from my eye. After the shooting at the hotel, they came and took me, put a hood on me, and moved me somewhere about 20 minutes drive away. They turned and doubled back so much I can't tell you the direction of travel. I spoke to Angie inside, and then they led me away and brought me here by boat. I was still hooded, but the boat was waiting right outside the location. There were steps down and sand, so wherever she is, it has to be on the waterfront. Angie is somewhere over there. I walked over to Michel, who was taking rapid, shallow breaths. He groaned as I approached, and I ignored his pathetic attempts to fight me off as I reached into his pocket for the phone he'd threatened Stamp with earlier. I stepped away and used it to call Justine. She answered almost immediately. "Hello? Jus, it's me. Jack, thank God. When Carver was shot at, I feared the worst. I'm okay," I assured her. "Where are you?" "In some sort of equipment store with Secretary Carver and his people," she replied. "They're preparing to evacuate him. The threat here is over. I don't know if there are others, but Kendrick Stamp did the right thing and missed on purpose," I said, looking at Stamp, whose eyes shone with fear and uncertainty about his decision. I knew exactly how he felt, having lost Justine to these men a few days earlier. "I need you to ask Carver to run a trace on the last 5 numbers into and out of this phone, and I need it now. Angie Stamp is being held hostage somewhere in Monaco, and I've promised we'll find her, so I need the location of any device that's had contact with his phone." "I'm on it," Justine said, before hanging up. I turned to Stamp, who signaled to Michel. His eyes were glassy, and his bloody chest was still. He was dead. I felt no pity for a person who'd been part of such evil. "We need to be ready to move," I told Stamp, as I crouched to pick up Michel's fallen pistol, a Dan Wesson DWX, which was an excellent close-range weapon. Stamp grabbed the sniper rifle and took an ammunition box from beneath the gyroscopic platform. "I'm ready," he said. "Good, let's go," I replied, and we headed for the rib.
Chapter 84. Justine stood beside Greg Campbell in a corrugated steel equipment store built beneath the grandstand. She'd been bustled into the room by the big Secret Service agent who had followed his colleagues. They'd done a magnificent job of clustering to shield Carver, and had got him to this secondary location in under a minute. The atmosphere in the equipment store was tense. The ranking agent in charge coordinated with the extraction team via radio, urging them to make ready. Justine heard an announcement on the public address system in French and English, saying qualifying had stopped pending the resolution of certain technical issues. She wondered how many people who'd been sitting near Carver would know the true meaning of the phrase technical issues, and whether news of the shooting would spread. Even if it did, members of the public who reported an unconfirmed assassination attempt on social media would likely be dismissed as conspiracy cranks. There would undoubtedly be race footage of Carver being hurried from the stand, but TV companies might not release it, and even if they did, the Secretary's media team could say the two events were unrelated. The public would only know about the assassination attempt if Carver or the U.S. government wanted them to. The sour note in the room was the presence of Henry Wilson, who stood in the opposite corner near the door. He didn't take his eyes off Justine and Greg. And prior to Jack's call, Justine had been wondering what to do about this man who probably wanted her dead. She clasped her phone tightly and made for Carver, who seemed bewildered. He sat on a metal equipment chest and caught his breath. His detail bristled as she approached, and a couple of agents stepped toward her. "Please stay back, ma'am," one of them said. "She's okay," Greg told his colleagues, but his words didn't really register because Wilson yelled over him, "Get this woman out of here! She poses a security risk!" "Henry?" Carver said. "I think she's been working with the people behind all this," he replied, "the people who just tried to shoot you. She knew about the attack in advance. She caused a distraction when it happened." "Me?" Justine said in disbelief. "Why would I warn you about an attack I was a part of?" "That's something we'll have to find out," Wilson responded. "You're the one who's behind this," Justine said. "You've been helping Roman Verde." "I knew she'd do this," Wilson said with an exasperated sigh. "She's trying to make the people in this room distrust one another, which is why she needs to be placed under arrest and taken away from here. She's the outsider. She doesn't belong, and she's dangerous. Get her out." Obviously tired of talking, he stepped forward and grabbed Justine's wrist, which was still sore from being manhandled by Greg. She wasn't about to allow herself to be assaulted by a man she suspected had betrayed his country and employer, and who had likely played a role in her own abduction and the attempted murder of her and her friends. She slipped his grasp and slapped him hard. He staggered back for a moment, but when his shock evaporated, he lunged for her, swinging his fists. Justine ducked and dodged his wild punches, and Greg stepped in and responded to the attack with a right cross that caught the smaller man on the nose and knocked him on his backside. "What the hell is happening?" Carver asked. Henry Wilson wiped his bleeding nose gingerly and tried to stand, but Greg pushed him back down. "Stay there," he said before turning to Justine. "You wanted to look at his arm? Which one?" "No," Wilson protested. "You can't do this." "Both," Justine replied. He tried to resist as Greg came at him. "Pete, can you get hold of this guy?" Greg asked, and one of his colleagues stepped forward, squatted, and put Wilson into a chokehold. "It'll be easier on you if you cooperate," Greg said, "but you don't have to be conscious for this." Henry Wilson stopped struggling while Greg ripped open his shirt and pulled his jacket off to expose his bare upper arms. There, tattooed on the inside of Henry's upper right arm, where the skin was at its softest and most sensitive, was the fleur-de-lis inside the Jerusalem cross, the mark of propaganda trait. Chapter 85. "It's just a tattoo," Wilson said. "I know exactly what it is," Carver responded coldly. His aide's indignation and anger melted away to be replaced by shame. He started shaking and seemed to shrink as he cowered on the floor of the store. "Why, Henry?" Carver asked, gesturing at the tattoo. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. Tears filled his eyes. He looked like a child caught out in a lie. And Justine's experience told her the shame he felt was for his exposure, not his wrongdoing. Criminals who repented rarely did so immediately, and this kind of reaction was grounded in self-pity and a sense of humiliation rather than genuine contrition. "I can answer your questions, Mr. Secretary, but right now I need your help," she said. "Jack's trying to find someone, and he believes they were in communication with this number." She held out her phone and showed him details of the most recent call. "I need you to run a trace as fast as you can." Carver nodded. "Do it," he said to the man called Pete, who'd had his arms around Wilson's neck. Pete approached Justine and took a photograph of the number displayed on her phone screen. "Thanks," she said. He remained impassive. With the air of someone who rarely smiled, he stepped into the far corner of the room and typed a message into his phone. Justine turned to Carver. "Jack suspected they were going to use him to target you because he could get close. They gave him a 3D printed resin gun and bullets to circumvent security. The other shooter was meant to be a backup. But he became their primary after I escaped, didn't he?" Her question was directed at Wilson, who didn't respond. "But this was a contingent trip. It would only take place if the summit ended early. And it wasn't known outside your immediate circle, which is why we suspected someone was working against you, feeding information to Philip Duval, who was sending it on to Propaganda Tray. I never expected that person to be a member of the group, too." Carver looked as though he'd been punched. "Is this true, Henry?" He couldn't even bring himself to look at the man he'd betrayed. "I bet an investigation will find he has a secret phone he used to send coded messages giving information on your movements to another phone in Duval's possession." Wilson's expression of shame seemed to intensify. "Your friend and colleague set you up, Mr. Secretary," Justine said, noting Carver's pained expression. "The only thing I don't know is why." "They didn't tell me," Wilson responded, finally breaking his silence. His eagerness to talk suggested to Justine he was lying. "I'm low down in the organization." Carver's face hardened. It was one thing to hear Justine's explanation and speculation, quite another to hear a confession. The Secret Service detail closed around the disgraced aide, and Justine could feel their anger. She guessed they weren't just enraged by the betrayal of their principal, but also by the fact the aide had put them in the line of fire. "I don't think he's telling the truth," Justine said. "I think he's lying, and that he knows why you were targeted, Eli." Wilson scowled at her. "I want him taken into custody," Carver said. "I want him on the next plane home, and I want him to be given special VIP treatment. And when he's told us everything he knows, I want him to stand trial." Carver pushed his way through the gathered Secret Service agents and stood over Wilson. "I'm going to make you regret you were ever born." Pete looked up from his phone. "We have a hit, sir. The number Miss Smith gave us was used to call a phone in Monaco. I'll have a location in a few seconds."
Chapter 86. We waited impatiently. I sat at the stern with the outboard motor idling, while Stamp was in the bow of the rib, holding the line loosely looped around a cleat to keep it connected to the Sunset Prince. I could feel the determination radiating off him, as though sheer force of will would bring him the location of his wife. I sympathized. That had been me a few days ago, when I'd been frantic and would have done anything to get Justine back. I doubted I could have sat as patiently as Stamp was doing now, and could only admire the man's external stoicism in the face of what I knew was inner turmoil. I regretted Michelle's death, and that of the other guy I'd kicked down the stairs into the galley. It turned out he wasn't unconscious. The fall had broken his neck, killing him instantly. This meant there was no chance of extracting Angie's location from either man, and instead of facing justice for their crimes, both had experienced quick and relatively painless deaths, which felt too much like an escape. My phone rang, and I saw Justine's number on screen. "Jack, it's me. We've got a location. It's a villa on the coast in the Cap d'Ale, and it belongs to Raymond Chalmont." We must have disrupted their plans quite considerably for them to be using an address so clearly connected to one of their principals. Or perhaps it was simply arrogance on their part. Maybe Chalmont believed himself above the law in Monaco. "I'm sending you a map pin," Justine said. "It will give you the exact location. Do you want me to notify the police?" "Yes. Call Chevalier and ask her to bring a tactical unit and meet us there." "Jack," Justine began. "I know," I said. "Be careful." "No," she responded. "I was going to ask you to make sure these guys don't escape. I want them to get what they deserve. For me, for Cy, for Mo." "You have my word," I told her. "We're about to move to a more secure location," she said. "I've got to go. I love you." "Love you too," I replied, before hanging up. I checked my phone and saw Justine had sent me a map pin for a location a couple miles southwest of our current position. "We've got it," I said to Stamp. "Let's go." He pulled in the line, and I backed us away from the yacht. When we were clear, I twisted the throttle, and the rib gathered speed. The bow rose, and the boat bounced against the waves as we raced through wind and spray, engine humming, speeding toward the cruel, twisted men who held Angie Stamp. Chapter 87. The boat was fast. We crossed the bay in minutes and made it round the headland to the southwest, leaving the cacophony and turmoil of the race behind us. The waters beyond the headland were quiet, and high above us on the rock bluffs that rose from the sea stood magnificent villas and apartment buildings. A few had pontoons with little sailing dinghies and motorboats bobbing alongside them on the warm, crystal-clear water. It was a paradise on earth, and I wondered why a man who had so much would gamble at all. Why would an establishment figure like Raymond Chalmont associate with men like Roman Verde and give his house over to them? Greed, fear, or belief? Based on what we knew of Propaganda Tre, I guessed belief. The organization's emphasis on far-right ideology and supposedly traditional values that were just a thin veneer for hate. But I wouldn't know for certain until I investigated the man. Roman Verde was easier to understand. A hardened criminal once motivated by greed, now driven by revenge and whatever corrupting agenda Propaganda Tre had twisted him and his men to believe. I hadn't thought much about my own beliefs since leaving Rome, and in truth had been afraid to probe them. I'd met good and bad in the Vatican, and had left the city resolved to continue with my own way of making the world a better place. It might not involve the dogma and observances of the church, but I was on the front line, waging a battle against evil every single day. I was doing it now, facing down these men, taking Stamp to find and save his wife. He had stayed at the bow, spotting, while I piloted us toward the marker Justine had sent. The spray and fresh air felt good against my face. In any other circumstances, this would have been a beautiful trip, but instead it was darkened by the fact we were trying to outrun death and reach Angie before Roman executed her for Stamp's failure to complete his mission. I checked my phone. We were close now. The run of pontoons ended, and the hilltops turned wild for a while as we traveled westward. There were no obvious signs of habitation. "Ahead," Stamp said, pointing to a lone pontoon that extended into the water like a solitary finger. "Slow down." I did as he suggested and could see why. There were 2 men patrolling the pontoon, tiny figures in black combat trousers and t-shirts, each holding a submachine gun. With the engine cut, the rib soon drifted to a complete stop. Stamp knelt and positioned the rifle against his shoulder. It would be a challenging shot. "Wind is coming from the west, about 15 knots, I told him. He nodded his thanks and calibrated his sight. There was no gyroscope here, so he'd have to compensate for the waves by moving his body and timing his shots perfectly. The men seemed to be looking our way, but at this distance they couldn't possibly know who we were, and without field glasses or telescopic sights, they wouldn't be able to see the rifle and scope. To them, we were probably a couple of fishermen poaching their waters. I willed Stamp to take the shot nonetheless, because there was a risk one of them would catch reflected glare off the scope or be sufficiently eagle-eyed to register his sniper stance. He held his breath and squeezed the trigger. The man to the right, closest to the beach, bucked, his head snapping back suddenly. He fell to the ground. His comrade to the left, further out to sea, registered the shot, looked at his dead companion, and started running. Stamp tracked him as he ran along the pontoon toward the shore and fired 3 shots in quick succession. The third struck him in his right leg and sent him tumbling into the water. As he thrashed, trying to make it to the short, sandy beach, Stamp shot him again, striking him in the back of the neck and killing him instantly. "Good shooting," I said without emotion. Stamp grunted, and I turned the throttle and steered us toward the pontoon. My stomach tightened as I felt a rush of adrenaline flood my body. I'd learned fear was an ally. It was not to be suppressed or fought, it was to be channeled. The most effective warriors used it to heighten their senses. They let it flow around them like electricity, giving them power, an edge over their enemies. Outwardly calm, they mastered their fear to their advantage, and I did so now. When we reached the pontoon, Stamp jumped out and tied the line to a cleat. He left his rifle in the rib and grabbed the submachine gun and spare ammunition from the first man he'd shot. I was content with Michelle's pistol. "Ready?" I asked. Stamp nodded, and we ran toward the beach. Chapter 88. Our footsteps hammered a rapid beat across the wooden planks and fell silent when we reached the soft sand. The beach was set in a small cove with high cliffs enclosing the golden crescent on 3 sides. We hurried north toward a set of roughly hewn stone steps that curved round the cliffside and led up to the summit. We moved in single file, me first and Stamp following a few paces behind, with his submachine gun raised and ready for action. We left the beach behind us and climbed the steps, creeping to minimize noise. The stairs became more finely crafted as we neared the top, and were set with a decorative inlay. I peered over the last one and saw a path that wound through ornamental woodland. It led to a large lawn, beyond which lay a swimming pool, and behind that a large, beautiful Mediterranean villa. This was the kind of home most people could only dream of, and I wondered why it wasn't enough for Raymond Chalmont. I caught movement to our right and saw one of Roman's men, dressed in black, smoking a vape and kicking the ground absently as he looked at the house. He was about 20 paces away and had his back to us. I signaled Stamp to wait. He nodded, and I climbed the final few steps and crept across the tufty grass at the top of the cliff. The man in black heard me moving toward him and turned. After a moment's shock, he reached for a pistol tucked into his waistband, and I rushed him as he tried to pull it on me. He managed to get the gun out, but before he could bring it up, I hit him with my gun, catching him across the temple. The blow knocked him down, and he fell still. Stamp came up behind me and kicked the unconscious man in the ribs. I understood his anger, even if I didn't agree with his action. We moved on through the trees. Sunshine danced between the gently rustling branches. This would have been a beautiful spot for a family picnic. But instead of using his resources for good, Chalmont had diverted them and made this a place of evil. We reached the end of the wood and peered across the lawn to the house. There was a circular turret to one side of the building that gave the rooms that overlooked the sea almost 360-degree views. "Lots of open ground," Stamp remarked, nodding at the rolling lawn. "Yeah," I agreed. "I'll go first. You cover me." He nodded, and I took a deep breath and started across the grass. There was no point trying to be stealthy. I was exposed and vulnerable in the full glare of the sun and needed to change that as quickly as possible. My heart thundered as I sprinted across the lawn. Fear heightened my senses. I looked around, alert to danger. I was about halfway between the trees and the house when I saw another black-clad gunman rush through French doors at the back and use his submachine gun to start spraying the garden around me with bullets. The air crackled as the turf ahead of my feet was churned and shredded by bullets. The gunman moved rapidly across the terrace toward the pool house for some cover and to get a better angle of fire on me. I shot at him, and Stamp joined the effort, lighting up the area around the pool house with heavy fire, forcing the shooter to take cover behind the small structure. I sprinted over the final stretch of grass, ran up a grand staircase, and crouched on the patio beside the pool, taking cover behind a stone balustrade, aiming my pistol so I was ready when the man broke cover. Suddenly aware of movement behind me, I turned and fired instinctively, hitting another gunman who'd emerged from the bushes on the far side of the swimming pool. Stamp signaled to me from the tree line, indicating he was going to make a run for it. I knew he was trying to lure the man behind the pool house out from his protected position. I nodded, and he ran across the lawn, legs hammering at full speed. The gunman behind the pool house broke cover to target Stamp. I trained my gun on the man and pulled the trigger twice. I shot him in the chest, and he collapsed against the pool house wall and slid to the ground, his eyes glassy and lifeless. Stamp joined me by the pool. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, and we set off around the swimming pool towards the house. Chapter 89. There were steps up to another terrace that was furnished with a large table, chairs, sofas, recliners, and a wet bar. I imagined the parties that could have been held in such a place. Had Chalmont schmoozed Monegasque high society here? Had he used his power and influence to further the aims of his criminal accomplices? Despite the sun-kissed beauty of the place, I couldn't help but feel it was rotten to the core. Beyond the broad terrace were some French doors. They stood wide open and led into a lavish kitchen. As we headed there, the top of the exterior dining table beside us erupted, splintering as bullets hit it. Stamp and I took cover behind a patio sofa, and I peered round it to see a gunman in a second-floor window inside the circular turret. He opened fire again, shredding the sofa near me, sending fabric and shards of wood everywhere. The noise was deafening and set my ears ringing, and I knew our flimsy cover wouldn't hold against such an assault for long. "Second floor, turret window, third from the left," I yelled at Stamp. "You go right, I'll go left." He nodded, and I held up my fist to signal us to stay put while the storm of bullets continued to rain down. The shooting stopped. I lowered my fist, and we broke cover. I rolled out from behind the wall into a kneeling stance and aimed at the shooter. As the man targeted me in reply, Stamp opened fire from my right, and a volley of bullets hit the marksman in the window, sending him bucking backwards into the shadows of the room. I nodded my appreciation at Stamp, and he nodded back. Taking a life was rarely something to be celebrated, but sometimes it was necessary. I was always wary of those who reveled in killing. Stamp had the cold detachment of a professional soldier. I was glad to have him by my side. We rose and ran across the terrace, and I went into the house first, barreling through the French doors and rolling to my knees. I was glad I did, because a gunman appeared from behind a counter with a pistol in hand and shot the air where my head had been a split second earlier. I responded with a single shot that hit his chest, and he fell back against a large silver double refrigerator and slumped down, groaning. "Do you have any idea where they were keeping Angie?" I whispered. Stamp shook his head. "Were you taken up or down any stairs?" "No," he said quietly. "Not until we got outside. They led me down to the boat the way we've just come." "Then she was on the first floor," I responded. "We search this place methodically until we find her." We moved through the large kitchen silently and carefully. I could hear the waves lapping against the sand in the bay below us, and the sounds of distant traffic, but the house was still. My heart pounded and my ears hummed, straining against the silence. The pistol felt heavy in my hand, and my eyes darted in one direction and then another as I searched for danger. I had no doubt it was close. We stepped into a corridor that ran through the heart of the house. Elaborately framed paintings hung on the walls, and classical sculptures together with urns filled with flowers were displayed on marble plinths. The place screamed wealth, but it looked tasteless and overblown to me, particularly knowing the criminal enterprises of its owner. Stamp stopped suddenly, and I did likewise. He signaled to some double doors on the other side of the corridor and indicated he had heard a sound. I nodded, held my gun in the ready position, and the two of us moved toward the doors. I reached for the brass handle and opened the door nearest me. I crept inside a huge drawing room, at least 40 feet long and 30 wide. The space was furnished like the grand salon of a French chateau, with chairs and couches in gilded frames, delicate Aubusson carpets over parquet flooring, and 18th-century paintings depicting scenes from Greek mythology. Here Zeus held a lightning bolt, ready to fling it against his enemies. There Heracles fought the lion. Standing in the middle of the room was Roman Verde. He was holding Angie Stamp, with one of his hands over her mouth. The other clasped a pistol, which he pressed to her temple. Chapter 90. "Secretary Carver is still alive," Roman said, "which means your wife's life is a forfeit." "Don't," Stamp replied through gritted teeth. I trained my pistol on Verde. Angie couldn't talk, but her eyes told me everything. She was terrified, not just for herself, but for her husband. Tears were visible when she looked at him. "We're not here to have a movie standoff," Roman Verde said. He turned his gun on me and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot seemed too loud for the room. It cracked like thunderclouds colliding. My left shoulder immediately felt like it had caught on fire, and the flames instantly turned to agony as the bullet drilled straight through me. It felt as though I'd been hit by a truck. I couldn't stop myself from tumbling back. As I crashed to the floor, I dropped my pistol, and it clattered away, skidding toward one of the grand couches. I was suddenly painfully hot and broke into an instant sweat that cooled me far too fast, so that I swung between blazing heat and searing cold. The world swam, warping and bending into the most bizarre shapes. Time must have slowed for me, because all of this happened the instant before Verde arced his gun around and shot Stamp in the right thigh. The former Marine and FBI agent crumpled instantly as the leg gave way beneath him. He cried out and dropped his gun so he could clutch at the wound. "That's better," Verde said, his voice rising above the ringing in my ears, cutting through the pain that tormented me. "You people just don't get it. You wasted 3 lives today when you could have traded them for 1. I'm going to kill you all. And then I'm going to kill your friends and loved ones, and when I'm done, I will make a new plan to deal with Eli Carver. You changed nothing except the date of his death and yours." He took his hand away from Angie Stamp's mouth, and she cried out, "Ken!" I grimaced. I had to have answers, and I wanted to play for time. "I know why you chose me, revenge for your brother, but these two?" I indicated Kendrick and Angie Stamp. "These two," Verde interrupted. "Because he ruined a business deal and got me arrested. People who cross me pay the price." "I don't even know you," Stamp protested, his voice strained from the pain he was in. "That was your mistake," Verde said. "What about Duval?" I asked. "He failed us," Verde replied. "We don't tolerate failure, and knowing your reputation, I suspected you would tie him to us eventually. We are not the sentimental group, Mr. Morgan. Loyalty must be earned every single day." It was the justification of a psychopath trying to excuse acting on their every whim. "And why Carver?" I asked, casting my eyes around for a way out of this situation. Verde sneered. I grew aware of faint sounds, which grew louder with each passing second. Sirens. Verde had clearly heard them too, because he said, "Well, we'd better get this over before the police arrive. Which of you wants to see the other die?" he asked, addressing Angie and Kendrick Stamp. "Jack Morgan can watch you both, the last to taste a bullet, because I know how much he loves being a hero." "Don't," Stamp managed to say, grimacing with pain. I was in agony, but no amount of suffering could suppress the anger I felt toward this pitiless killer. I couldn't let us die here at his hands. I steeled myself. "If you can't make a choice, I'll choose for you," Verde said, and turned his gun on Angie. "You will watch your wife die." "No!" Stamp yelled as his wife broke into sobs. Verde smiled, and I saw his grip tighten on the gun. I rolled across the floor, ignored the explosion of pain that came with the movement, and grabbed my pistol. He reacted instinctively, pointing his gun toward me and opening fire, but his aim was off. I rolled onto my belly and shot him in the hip. He staggered back, relinquishing his hold on Angie, and she ran clear, giving me an open target. Verde brought his gun up and round, but he wasn't fast enough. I already had him in my sights and pulled the trigger twice. A brace of bullets hit him in the chest. He fell back against a marble and gilt gueridon table before rolling onto the floor, where he lay moaning and gasping. Chapter 91. I took a deep breath and instantly regretted it. My shoulder was a fiery, bloody mass of pain, and I almost blacked out. I tried to hold on to the world, to fight the bleak pull of unconsciousness, but part of me wanted to surrender to the darkness. Angie ran to her husband, and the two of them embraced and kissed. Their loving display reminded me of Justine. I wanted to see her more than anything, and fought the black cloud fraying the edges of reality. Pain cut through everything and shocked me to life. Like fear, I knew it could be channeled, so I tried to tame it. I wanted to escape it somehow, and my body's autonomic processes knew unconsciousness was the best way. But I tried to convince myself I could outrun it, and used it as a prompt to action, rising quickly and moving across the room once I'd got to my feet. I heard sirens close now and knew I didn't have long. Twitchy with the searing pain, I staggered over to Stamp and Angie. "You okay?" I asked, looking down at the wounded man. He had removed his belt and was tying a tourniquet around his upper thigh to stem the flow of blood. "I feel better than you look," he said. "You need a doctor." I nodded and moved on. Standing still meant the pain would catch me. Movement helped me outrun it. I lurched over to Roman Verde, who lay clutching the wounds in his chest. There was blood, but not the heavy pulsing flow of a ruptured artery, so I thought I'd missed his heart. However, the bubbling, rasping sound he made with each gasping breath suggested I'd punctured a lung. I loomed over him and kicked his pistol well clear of his grasp. "Why?" I asked. I bit my lip to keep myself from crying out in pain, and resisted the urge to inflict my suffering on the man who'd done this to me. He was clearly in his own physical hell. "Why?" I asked again. He looked up from contemplating the holes in his chest and fixed me with hostile eyes. There was nothing but contempt radiating from the man, and he knew the feeling was mutual. "Why Carver?" I pressed him. He shook his head, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer. "Peace," he gasped, his voice wet and rasping. "Peace is the enemy of all we stand for. He was supposed to die. Then evidence would have been released implicating participants in the peace negotiation. The treaty would have collapsed, leading to permanent war in Europe." "Why?" I asked. "What kind of people want never-ending war?" He smiled. "If you have to ask that question, you wouldn't understand the answer." "Who is behind Propaganda Trey?" I asked. "Who are you people?" Verde smiled. It was insincere and full of hatred. "Keep looking over your shoulder, Jack Morgan." The sirens were almost upon us. The first set of tires crunched over the gravel at the front of the house. "Lying on your back, shot and bleeding out, and you threaten me? I can handle whatever you send my way. Can you say the same thing?" I growled. "All your people will meet the same end, broken and ready to answer for what they've done." Verde's smile fell away, and his eyes narrowed. We both looked in the direction of the front door, which cracked and splintered as it was smashed open. Then came the tramp of heavy boots over hardwood floors, and moments later Valerie Chevalier stormed into the room at the head of a squad of cops in tactical gear. "Jack!" she yelled, and I followed her gaze to see that Verde had produced a second pistol from behind his back. It was a snub-nosed .22 revolver, the kind of gun used in street muggings and gangland killings, and it was pointed directly at my head. "Can you handle everything I send your way?" he rasped. "Goodbye, Mr. Morgan." The sound of the shot turned my blood to ice. It took me a moment to realize it hadn't come from Roman's gun. A volley of bullets tore through his left eye, creating a bloody crater and ripping a path deep into his skull. His other eye went glassy and rolled back as his body went limp. His hand fell to the floor, and the gun clattered against the floor, but even in death he held it firm. I looked round to see Kendrick Stamp holding his submachine gun, the barrel still smoking. "Thanks," I said. "Don't mention it. We're even," he replied, pulling Angie close. Chapter 92. I looked down at Roman Verde's body. He would never trouble anyone ever again, and while I regretted the fact that I wouldn't have the opportunity to question him further, I'd rather be alive without all the answers than dead and gone. Police officers clustered around Angie and Kendrick Stamp, and one of them checked the tourniquet on Stamp's leg. "Is it good?" Angie asked anxiously. The police officer nodded at her and she smiled. "You okay?" I asked, staggering over to her. "Angie, this is Jack Morgan," Stamp introduced us. "He's the reason we're here." Her smile broadened and her eyes filled to overflowing. "Your husband is the reason we're here," I corrected him. "He could have taken the shot." "And then they would have killed us both," Stamp responded. "How did they get you out here?" I asked. Stamp grimaced. "I was retired from the Bureau on health grounds. Gunshot wound. They didn't think I still had what it takes, so I was looking for jobs in law enforcement or adjacent fields." He hesitated. "And?" I asked. "Philippe Duval got in touch and asked if I'd be interested in running the private office he was setting up with you here in Monaco," Stamp revealed. "He invited me to interview and said I could bring Angie as his guest." I shook my head and immediately regretted it. "I didn't know," I said. "I guessed that when you had no clue who I was," he replied. "But I want you to come and see me in Los Angeles when you've recovered," I told him. "I can always use good people, and you've shown me exactly how good you are." Stamp smiled, and Angie hugged him again. "Thanks," he said. Chevalier had been coordinating with colleagues. She walked over to Verde, confirmed he was dead, and then joined us. The pain in my shoulder gradually retreated from a raging blaze to a smoldering fire with occasional flares and sparks of agony. "There are ambulances on the way," she said. "Both of you need urgent attention." "I'm okay," I replied. She gave me a withering look. "Okay, I'm not okay, but I will be," I said, and took a seat on one of the ornate rococo chairs. Chevalier came to stand beside me. "Secretary Carver is safe, thanks to you and your team. I'll need a full account for my report, but that can wait for now. I just wanted to thank you for what you've done. You saved his life, and you saved this city from scandal and terror." I nodded almost imperceptibly. It hurt to move my head. "And the owner of this house?" I asked. "Raymond Chalmont?" "I don't yet understand how he is connected to what happened," Chevalier replied, "but we're looking for him." A smart man would be on his way out of the country by now, if he hadn't already left. Nice Airport was a short drive away and could take a person west to the Americas, south to Africa, or east to the farther reaches of Europe and Asia, but I didn't share these concerns with her. "Jack!" Justine cried, straining to get past an officer in tactical gear who held her at the door. "Let her in," Chevalier told her colleague, and he allowed Justine to pass. She ran over and crouched down level with me, but hesitated when she saw my bullet wound. "Oh, my God!" she said, her voice full of concern. "Jack!" "It's not as bad as it looks," I assured her, trying to conceal the pain I felt when talking. "It went straight through." She winced and shook her head. "I'd hug you and kiss you if I knew it wouldn't make you pass out." I replied in kind, forcing a smile through the pain. "Me too." "And then I'd punch you for putting yourself in this kind of danger," she said. And my smile grew broader. "I'd still hug and kiss you," I said. "Me too, and I wouldn't really punch you," she responded tenderly. "You did a good thing. I'm just sorry to see you suffering, both of you." She glanced round at Stamp before her eyes drifted to Verde's body. "And it makes me angry to see such meaningless violence because of the arrogance of evil men." "I know," I told her. "What happened to Carver?" "They took him back to his hotel," she revealed. "I get the impression it's become a fortress." "And the race?" I asked. "Qualifying restarted. They told everyone it was a technical difficulty." "Carver can watch it from the hotel. The Fairmont hairpin is a pretty spectacular section, and he'll have a suite with a view." 4 paramedics hurried into the room and split into 2 teams. The first pair went to Kendrick Stamp, and the second came to me. "He speaks English," the inspector told them. "That's not his fault," the lead paramedic said. She was a thin, cheerful woman in her 20s with long blonde hair. "I'll speak slowly so he understands." I smiled, and so did her colleague, a man in his 30s with brown hair and a golden tan. The lead paramedic lifted my shirt collar, and I winced as the fabric pulled away from my wound. "We'll patch you up in the ambulance," she said, "but you'll almost certainly need surgery at the hospital." I nodded. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied. "I think so." "Then let's go." She and her colleague tried to help me to my feet. "Please, don't touch me," I said, rising gingerly. Kendrick's paramedics had left the room to retrieve a gurney. He nodded at me. "See you in Los Angeles, Mr. Morgan." "Call me Jack," I replied through gritted teeth. "We can get the wheelchair or a trolley," the lead paramedic said. I had nothing against wheelchairs, but I felt it was important to leave this place under my own steam, to show the universe and myself that these men hadn't been able to drag me down. The paramedics walked either side of me, and Justine followed us out. The sunshine felt good against my face. As I shuffled toward the waiting ambulance, I was glad to have put our ordeal behind us. Chapter 93. I was taken to Princess Grace Hospital and scanned before undergoing surgery on my shoulder. My surgeon, Christos Argyropoulos, assured me it was a routine patch job. The scan showed the bullet had gone straight through with minimal tissue and bone damage. I went into theater, but the work was done under local anesthetic, so I got to listen to the Greek doctor cracking wise with his team while he worked. I wasn't squeamish, but there were times I had to look away as Christos and his American resident, Anthony Leonardi, sutured me inside and out. Thankfully, the surgical team had music playing, which helped distract me, as did the back and forth of good-hearted banter between the doctors who constantly ribbed each other. "Explain the role of T-cell differentiation in immunosenescence," Christos said. Anthony scoffed. "I'm not a med student anymore." "So you don't know?" the senior surgeon countered. "Of course I know, but I'm not educating you unless you agree to kale sandwiches for lunch." "Oh, don't threaten me with that foul weed," Christos responded, his face scrunching in disgust. His expression changed, and he was suddenly thoughtful. "We should get chili." He patted me on my good shoulder. "You're all done." "Thank you," I replied, "for fixing me and for the laughs." Their humor wasn't an indication of carelessness. It was a common trait in the Marine Corps and at private. It was the mark of professionals who had confidence in their abilities and were trying to take the heat out of what might have otherwise been a stressful experience for everyone involved, especially me. They'd given me exactly what I needed, and spending some time with people who took joy in everyday life was the perfect way to adjust back to normality. I was no longer facing immediate danger and needed to get myself out of the habit of viewing everyone as a potential threat. I had my arm put into a sling and was wheeled out of surgery, where I found Justine in the waiting area. Her expression was strained, but she smiled when she saw me looking so cheerful, and the tension melted out of her face. "Jack," she said, hurrying over. "I'm fine," I replied, "much better." I offered her my good hand, and she took it and squeezed it. We held each other as I was wheeled to my private room. Justine stayed with me as I regained my strength, but we passed much of the time in silence, simply enjoying one another's company and the joy of being alive. At 8 p.m., Christos came to check my dressing. "It looks good. Sutures are holding well," he said. "You can spend the night here, or I can discharge you, provided you promise there'll be no exertion." "It would be nice to go to the apartment," I replied. "Okay, no exertion. And if you notice any discharge or feel unwell in any way, you come straight back," he instructed. I nodded. "Okay, I'll write you a script for antibiotics and pain relief," he said. "You should be able to leave in 20 minutes. The pain relief I'd had pre-surgery had reduced the agony in my shoulder to a dull ache, and the sling restricted my movement to reduce the chance of my hurting myself. I felt confident I'd be comfortable out of hospital. Half an hour later, once my discharge paperwork was complete and a nurse had given me a prescription, Justine and I left my room and took an elevator to the 5th floor. We walked slowly, Justine giving me sidelong looks of concern, as though I was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. We rounded the corner and entered the private ward, where I saw the police officer who was supposed to be protecting our friends was missing. My instinct for danger hadn't died in the operating theater, and I felt a flush of adrenaline as I hurried to Sai's room and peered through the observation window. His bed was empty and neatly made. Had something happened to him? My heart sank. I couldn't take a loss like that. Justine tapped my good arm, and I turned to see her pointing at Mobot's room. Sai sat on the side of her bed, playing cards with her. There was a mobile IV stand by his side, the bag hanging from it feeding a line into a cannula in his left arm. The cop was at the end of the bed, joining in the fun, clasping a run of cards tightly so no one could see them. I smiled with relief, and Justine and I went inside. "Jack," Mobot said enthusiastically, "I see you've been making use of the facilities." She indicated my sling. "Come in. Sai's already lost his house to me. He's such a bad gambler." "We're not gambling. This is just for fun," he replied. "Oh, this is Officer Jean-Louis," Mobot said, and the young cop shifted uncomfortably. "I need to return to my post," he said, shamefaced. He sidled past us and shut the door on his way out. "What happened?" Sai asked, gesturing to my injured arm. "Roman Verde shot me," I replied. "He's not a problem anymore." There was a moment of silent reflection, which Mobot finally broke with a single word. "Good." "I'm glad to see you up and around," Justine told Sai. "Yeah, I don't do bed rest," he replied, "and you can imagine what this one is like stuck in here." He nodded at Mobot. "Hey," she protested. "I can't help it if I feel fine and they want to drive me out of my mind with boredom by keeping me for another 5 days?" "They reckon it'll be at least a week for me," Sai said. "Not quite the Riviera vacation I dreamed of." "But you're alive," I said, "and that's better than any vacation." "True," Sai replied. "Do you need anything?" I asked. "My computer," Mobot replied instantly. "Just the baby one so I can hack this place and bring my discharge forward." I smiled and shook my head. "No chance. You're not doing any work until the docs sign you off as fully recovered." "Killjoy," she countered. "I think we're good," Sai said. "You should get some rest. You look pretty pale." I nodded. "We'll check on you tomorrow, and we'll fill you in on exactly what happened with Carver and Roman Verde." Justine and I headed for the door. "Jack," Mobot said, and I paused. "Thanks for taking care of him." I glanced back at her. "Wasn't gonna end any other way," I said before leaving. Chapter 94. I slept through a long, dreamless night and woke at noon the following day when the sound of banging roused me. Justine stirred beside me. I groaned as I rolled out of bed, aware the painkillers had worn off. My shoulder felt raw and battered, as though someone had hit it with a meat-tenderizing hammer a couple 100 times, but it was bearable, just. I fumbled with a pair of shorts and managed to pull them on one-handed as there was another knock at the door. Justine sighed and got up. She slipped into a t-shirt as I staggered out of the bedroom, aware the pitch of the pain in my shoulder was rising, throbbing a little more urgently. I needed a fresh dose of painkillers, but whoever was knocking at the door was doing so insistently now. I opened it and was greeted by 4 faces. Eli Carver and 3 of his Secret Service agents, all somber, large men in dark suits. Wearing nothing but shorts, I suddenly felt very exposed. Mr. Secretary, I stammered. My head felt fuzzy, and I most definitely wasn't at my sharpest. I'm really sorry to walk in on you like this, Jack, Carver said, entering the apartment. His entitlement was strong, but I couldn't hold it against him. I wanted to check you were okay. We heard about what happened at Raymond Chalmont's place. You better come in, I told his detail. They'd hovered on the threshold, waiting for instructions. Thanks, the lead agent said, and they entered and spread out around the living room. I also wanted to invite you and Justine. Carver glanced at the corridor leading to the bedroom, where she had just appeared in her long t-shirt. Morning, he said to her. Sorry to intrude. I'd like to invite you both to be my guests at the race today, if you're up to it. He looked at my sling. Morning, Eli, Justine said. How's your arm? She asked me. I'll live. I just need some pills, I replied. I turned to Carver. I guess you won't take no for an answer? He smiled. 2 hours later, feeling more myself, fully dosed on painkillers, my hunger sated by a light sandwich lunch at the Fairmont, we joined Carver in the Monte Carlo casino stand where we watched the race build up. I was glad Justine and I had accepted the invitation. As she sat next to me holding my hand, I looked at her with adoring eyes, grateful the threat had passed and that we could be together without fear. Carver sat on my right, and we talked to him about the great races and drivers of the past, the likes of Schumacher, Hill, Senna, Prost, and Vettel. Carver was very knowledgeable and had nuggets of information about all of them. It wasn't until almost an hour after arriving at the stand, minutes before the race was due to start, when the hush of expectation had swept over the crowd, that he turned the conversation to more serious matters. I owe you my life again, Jack, he said quietly. I did what was necessary, Eli, I replied. He smiled at my use of his name. You went above and beyond, and I might not be here now if you hadn't done so. I'm in your debt again. What happened to Henry Wilson? I asked. Justine had told me all about her experiences with Carver's aid. He's on a plane back to Washington, Carver replied, his eyes narrowing. He's going to tell us exactly what he knows, and then he's going to face the full force of the law. I nodded. We're starting an operation against the remnants of Propaganda Trey and the Dark Fates, Carver revealed. I want to find every member and expose them to the light of justice. This isn't just about national security for me, Jack. It's personal. They tried to kill me. I understand, I replied. We'll share everything we have. Good. I want to make sure there aren't any other Henry Wilsons working against the U.S. government, hiding some perverse allegiance. What about Raymond Chalmont? I asked. Carver scoffed. He skipped the country, took a private plane to Morocco yesterday morning. We'll find him, though. In the meantime, we're going to freeze his assets. I don't think he'll cope well with hardship, I remarked. Carver smiled. Neither do I. He patted his thighs. Anyway, that can all wait. We're here to have fun. Looks like the race is starting. He gestured at the big screen to our right, which displayed the starting grid. 20 beautiful, slick, precision-engineered, super-powered machines lined up in 10 pairs, waiting for the lights to give them the go signal. I turned to Justine and kissed her. She smiled. The crowd cheered as the race started and the cars roared away. It was absolutely thrilling to hear them approaching, their engines sounding like savage monsters, making the world tremble and shake. I couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement as the leaders entered the Louis Chiron chicane, slowed momentarily like tamed beasts before rediscovering their inner animal and roaring as they shot away in front of us. I looked at Justine and saw her eyes, too, shining with excitement. Life was good. Belinda hopes you enjoyed the reading of Private Monaco, Private Book 19, written by James Patterson and Adam Hamdy, and read by Trevor White and Rachel Hanshaw. Our audiobooks are becoming increasingly popular among travelers, families, and people who are on the go. If you really enjoyed listening to this audiobook, please introduce your friends and family to the experience. We're sure they'll love you for it. If you want to hear more about our fabulous range of titles, please visit us online at belinda.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to always take a Belinda audiobook with you. Text copyright 2024 James Patterson. Recording copyright 2024.